Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I had always thought that working the night shift was just a way to escape the dullness of daylight. The quiet, the emptiness, the solitude, it was comforting in a strange way. But lately, something had changed. Something that didn't belong, something that crept under my skin and refused to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The question that kept echoing in my mind, more often now than before, was simple. What are they hiding? The office where I worked wasn't anything special, just an old building on the edge of town, the kind of place that no one really noticed unless they needed something. But the people who worked there, my colleagues, were another story. They were different. Quiet, yes, but also strangely attentive to each other in a way that made me feel like an outsider. The kind of attention that made me question everything they said, every gesture, every movement. They were all too calm. Too perfect. It all started with Julian, my supervisor. He was a man of few words, and his smile never reached his eyes. But it was the way he would watch me sometimes, just standing in the hallway or at his desk, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. His gaze was always calculating, as if he knew something I didn't, and I hated it. Then there was Anna. She was new. I'd never seen her before the night I began the shift, but she quickly settled into the team as if she'd always been there. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice was soft, smooth, like someone used to being listened to. But there was something off about her too, something subtle that I couldn't put my finger on. I noticed how she would stare at the door to the break room as if waiting for something or someone who never came. Sometimes, when I caught her gaze, her eyes seemed too wide, too bright. Like she wasn't fully aware of where she was. The first time I heard it, I thought I was imagining things. A soft clicking sound, almost like nails tapping against the floor, coming from the hallway just outside the office. At first, I figured it was just the building settling, some old pipes or creaking wood. But then I heard it again. And again. A rhythmic sound, too precise to be random. I would go to check, but by the time I stepped into the hall, there was nothing, just the stale, quiet air of an empty corridor. The sound had stopped. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it happened more often. The clicking. The faint rustle of fabric from the direction of the storage closet. The odd, distant hum of machinery that should have been turned off. I started asking questions, at first casually. Have you guys heard that sound at night? Like someone's walking around? Julian looked at me with his usual tight smile and said, "What sound?" It was a question so simple, so innocent, but there was something in the way he said it that made me want to take the question back. It felt wrong. I looked to Anna for an answer, but she just blinked at me, her gaze shifting nervously toward the break room. I couldn't get anyone to acknowledge what I was hearing. They acted as if it was all in my head. The nights grew longer, and the feeling of unease only deepened. I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving when no one was around, flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was never anything there. It was like the building itself was watching me, waiting. Then one night, when I was taking a break in the staff lounge, I noticed something different. A smell, faint but unmistakable. It was a strange, musty odor, like old wood and damp earth. At first, I thought it was just the building's age, but it lingered in the air, growing stronger. I walked over to the window to get some fresh air, but when I opened it, the smell only intensified. I was alone in the lounge, or so I thought, until I heard the footsteps again. I turned quickly, heart pounding in my chest, but no one was there. Just the flicker of the fluorescent lights above me. I couldn't help but wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. I began to feel the shift, like a strange pressure in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I started to notice that my coworkers were avoiding me more, glancing away whenever our paths crossed. Julian seemed to take more frequent breaks, and Anna would disappear for long periods, only to return with an expression I couldn't place, something like fear mixed with relief. I couldn't stop thinking about the clicking sound, the rustling noises, the sudden silences when everyone would go still as if waiting for something or someone. But the strangest part of it all was the way they would watch me. They were always watching me. And that was when I realized. They knew. They knew something about this place. Something I didn't. It wasn't long after that when the rumors started. Quiet whispers in the hallway, hushed conversations that stopped as soon as I walked into the room. But the real fear settled in the moment I saw it, the door at the back of the warehouse that I was never supposed to open. There was a reason no one talked about it. I don't know what I expected when I first laid eyes on that door. Maybe I thought it would be just like the others, ordinary, unremarkable, something that could be passed by without a second thought. But it wasn't. The door stood at the far end of the warehouse, hidden behind a stack of dusty crates and old boxes. It wasn't part of the usual layout. It didn't match the rest of the building. At first, I thought it was just another storage closet until I realized it had no handle. Just a thick, rusted lock, a padlock hanging loosely from the top, almost as if it were meant to be forgotten. No one ever spoke of it. No one ever acknowledged its existence, but I couldn't stop staring at it. There was something about it that felt wrong. The longer I worked there, the more I became obsessed with that door. It called to me, even while I was at my desk or taking calls. Something deep inside me needed to know what lay behind it, what my coworkers were so desperately trying to keep hidden. Every night, after the others had gone home, I would find myself standing near it. The sounds of the building, creaking floors, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of equipment would fade into the background. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the deep, gnawing pull to learn the truth. I was certain that door was the key to understanding what was happening, what they were hiding. I never saw Julian or Anna go near it. In fact, no one ever did. They kept their distance, and I couldn't help but wonder why. What was so important about keeping this door closed? Why didn't they want anyone to see what was inside? One evening, after another long shift, I found myself walking toward it again. My hands were shaking as I approached, and the air felt thick with something that was almost tangible. It was like the building itself was alive, its heartbeat thumping in the walls, in the floor, in my chest. I stood in front of the door, staring at the rusted lock. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a strange mark on the wood beside it. A small, faint scratch, like something had scraped against the door over and over until it left a scar. My fingers brushed against it, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot up my spine. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, almost like a voice, muffled but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. You're not supposed to be here. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. My eyes scanned the empty warehouse, but I saw nothing. No one. Just the heavy silence that had descended on the place. The whisper had come from behind the door. I was sure of it. I stepped back, almost stumbling over my feet. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. It was too much to understand all at once. The fear that had been building inside me suddenly exploded. My palms were sweating, my breathing shallow. I turned and ran, not caring about anything but getting as far away from that door as possible. The hallway felt longer than usual, the lights flickering overhead, casting strange shadows against the walls. I could still hear that voice in my head, the words echoing, bouncing off the inside of my skull. You're not supposed to be here. When I reached the break room, I slumped against the wall, gasping for air. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I wiped my face, trying to calm myself down, but it didn't help. The tension was still there, hanging in the air like a cloud of smoke that wouldn't dissipate. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just tired, that the stress of the shift was getting to me. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had heard something, and whatever it wasn't just in my head. The next few nights were worse. The whispers grew more frequent, the sounds more distinct. I could hear them even when I wasn't near the door. I started to hear footsteps behind me in the hall, voices that weren't there, strange rustling sounds coming from the storage rooms. It felt like I was being watched constantly, like there was something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. And then, one night, something happened that pushed me over the edge. I was alone in the warehouse, everyone else had left for the night. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt more trapped than ever. The lights went out. It wasn't a normal blackout. The lights didn't flicker or fade. They simply stopped. I sat in the pitch-black darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavy, like the room had been suffocated. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own pulse. That's when I heard it again. Click, click, click. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, getting closer. Closer. I wasn't alone anymore, and I wasn't sure I ever had been. I sat frozen in the darkness, my heart beating so loudly I was sure whoever, or whatever, was in the room could hear it. The clicking of footsteps grew closer, methodical, unhurried. It sounded like someone pacing in the shadows, just out of my reach. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe. Every inch of the warehouse felt like it was closing in on me. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like the darkness had wrapped itself around me, pinning me to the spot, rendering me powerless. Click, click. I held my breath, straining to hear through the silence that enveloped me. The footsteps weren't getting any closer. They were circling me, around me. I could feel the weight of them, feel the presence pressing in, but when I tried to look, there was nothing, just shadows. Shadows that seemed too deep, too solid, to be real. Click, click. It stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than the sound of the footsteps. My breath was ragged, my palms sweating. I wiped them against my pants, feeling the cold sweat stick to my skin. I couldn't understand what was happening. None of it made sense. I swallowed, trying to steady myself, trying to think clearly. The only light was the faint glow from the emergency exit sign at the far end of the warehouse. It barely cut through the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. Then, through the blackness, I heard it. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was low, rasping, as if it were coming from the very walls. It was the same whisper I'd heard before, but this time it was louder, more menacing. It sent a chill down my spine, crawling up my neck. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had imagined the footsteps, imagined the voice. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the temperature in the room drop. It was as if something was draining the warmth from the air, leaving only a bone-chilling cold in its wake. You shouldn't have come back. The voice came again, louder this time, and closer. I could feel it, like a breath against my ear, as if someone were standing just behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was nothing. No one. Just the shadows, thick and all-consuming. I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled to my feet, my knees shaky beneath me. The emergency exit was the only way out, but the thought of walking toward it, toward that glowing red light, felt like an impossible task. I felt like I was being pulled in 1,000 directions, each one more terrifying than the last. The whispers were getting louder now, filling the space with a chorus of voices. They weren't just one voice anymore. They were many, thousands of them, overlapping, unintelligible, rising in volume until they became a roar in my ears. You shouldn't have come back. He's waiting. He's waiting for you. The words repeated, but now they were clearer, more distinct. I could feel them, like a weight on my chest, suffocating me. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But every time I tried to move, my legs betrayed me, refusing to cooperate. I was frozen, trapped in this nightmare. I looked around, trying to find something, anything, that would help. My eyes darted across the room, searching for the familiar layout of the warehouse, but everything looked different. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, distorting in the dim light. The crates that had once been stacked neatly now loomed like towering figures, casting long, ominous shadows. The place was no longer the safe, mundane work environment I'd grown accustomed to. It had become something else entirely, a place of darkness, of something sinister that I couldn't understand. Then, a movement caught my eye. A figure, tall, shadowy, was standing by the door. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of a person. It was still, silent, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The whispers, the clicking of the footsteps, they all faded into the background. All that mattered was the figure standing there, just out of reach. I had a choice. I could run, try to escape this place, this nightmare. Or I could confront whatever it was, whatever was lurking in the shadows. But deep down, I already knew the answer. The question wasn't whether I should face it, it was whether I could escape it once I did. Before I could decide, the figure moved. Slowly, methodically. I gasped, stumbling back. It was coming toward me, its steps measured, deliberate. I tried to run. My legs finally obeyed, and I pushed myself toward the emergency exit with everything I had. But as I reached for the handle, something grabbed me. Cold fingers, like ice, wrapped around my wrist. You shouldn't have come back. The whisper was louder than ever, and I felt my body freeze in place, trapped by the unseen force. My breath caught in my throat as the cold fingers tightened around my wrist, pulling me back into the blackness. The whisper echoed in my mind, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was everywhere, inside my head, in the walls, in the very air I breathed. I could feel the pressure building, a weight pushing down on me from all sides. It wasn't just the physical grip on my wrist, it was the force of the darkness itself, wrapping around me, pulling me closer to whatever lay within the depths of the warehouse. I tugged, desperately trying to break free, but the cold fingers were unyielding. The more I struggled, the tighter they gripped. It felt like my entire arm was being encased in ice, my skin burning with the sensation of freezing metal. The cold was seeping into my bones, numbing me from the inside out. I turned, half expecting to see a figure, something standing right behind me, watching me, waiting for me. But when I twisted around, there was nothing there, nothing but shadows, thick and inky, swallowing the light. And yet, I felt it. I felt its presence, pressing in from every angle. The walls seemed to be closing in, the ceiling lowering, the air growing heavier and colder. It was like the building itself had become alive, shifting, moving, reacting to me. I gasped for air, but it felt like there was none left to breathe. My chest tightened, and panic surged through me. The whispering voices, now a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs, only intensified the fear building inside me. I had to get out. I had to escape. With all the strength I could muster, I yanked my wrist free from the icy grip. The cold receded, but it left an aftershock, an aching, burning sensation that lingered in my skin. I stumbled back, falling to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like jelly. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, as if the very floorboards were twisting, bending, warping under my weight. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But I couldn't afford to pass out. I had to keep moving. I pushed myself up, using the crates nearby to steady myself. The emergency exit was so close, just a few more steps. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, watching, waiting. The air grew thicker, the shadows darker, as if the darkness itself was alive, hungry. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. A figure, a silhouette, standing at the far end of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form twisted and grotesque. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, its movements jerky, unnatural. But what struck me the most was its face. Or, rather, the lack of one. The figure had no face. Just a smooth, featureless expanse where its features should have been. But I could feel its gaze, those empty, hollow spaces staring into me, through me. It was as if it could see everything, know everything, and there was nowhere to hide. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, staring at me, waiting. And then, the whispers started again. But this time, they weren't just whispers. You're here. You're here because you didn't listen. You didn't leave. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was coming from the figure, from the very air around me. Its voice was low, gravelly, like it had been dragged across the ground, and it sent a wave of nausea through me. I had to move. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my legs finally obeying me, pushing me toward the exit. But as I sprinted, I felt the temperature drop even further, the cold seeping into my skin, numbing me. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, narrowing the hallway, swallowing the light. The exit sign, once so clear, now seemed distant, fading with every step I took. I reached for the door handle, but as my fingers touched it, the air shifted, and I was thrown back, crashing into the crates behind me. My body slammed into the cold floor, and pain shot through my limbs. I gasped, struggling to breathe, but the air felt thick, choking me. I pushed myself up again, but this time there was no escape. The figure was closer now, moving toward me, its long limbs dragging behind it like dead weight. Its featureless face seemed to ripple, like it was shifting, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't run. I couldn't move. The room was closing in on me. The walls were too close. The shadows too thick. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to turn. You shouldn't have come back. The voice filled the space, louder now, overwhelming. I could feel it in my head, in my chest, in my bones. It was as if the very words were tearing me apart from the inside. I screamed. I had no control over it. It was the only sound in the world, a desperate cry for help that no one could hear. But the darkness didn't care. And as the figure reached out with its long, skeletal hand, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no way out. The cold hand wrapped around my throat with such force that it felt as if it was squeezing the very life out of me. The fingers dug into my skin, icy and unyielding, sending a wave of panic through my chest. I could no longer scream, no longer move. My vision began to blur, the room spinning as I gasped for air, but none came. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating me. The figure loomed over me, its featureless face inches from mine, and I could feel its hunger. It wasn't just after my body, it was after something deeper, something that went beyond flesh and bone. It wanted my soul, my fear, my very essence. The room seemed to narrow, the walls bending inwards as if they were alive, reacting to the creature's presence. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears, each pulse growing weaker, more distant. The air felt thick with despair, as if all the hope had been sucked out of the room. And then, the whispers returned, louder, clearer, and more persistent than before. You can't escape. You never could. The voice echoed in my head, slithering through my thoughts like a poisonous snake. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was many, overlapping, a cacophony of tortured souls, all trapped in this place. Their voices were desperate, pleading, warning me. And I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I wasn't the first. I wasn't the first to make the mistake of returning. We are all trapped here, they whispered in unison. We are all part of it now. I fought to push the figure away, my hands trembling, my body weak and cold. I couldn't breathe, but somehow I found the strength to claw at its hand, to pry its fingers off my throat. The coldness was suffocating, but something deeper, something primal, was pushing me to survive. For a moment, the figure hesitated, its grip loosening just enough for me to take a gasping breath. The room seemed to hold its breath too, as if everything was waiting for what would happen next. And that's when I saw it, the faintest glimmer of light, flickering in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I didn't know if it was real or if I was losing my mind, but in that instant, it felt like my only chance, my only escape. I lunged forward, breaking free from the figure's grasp, stumbling toward the light. My legs shook beneath me, my body barely functioning, but I didn't care. I had to get to the door, had to get to the exit. The darkness seemed to scream in protest, the shadows reaching out, clawing at my legs, pulling me back, but I didn't stop. My fingers brushed the door handle, and for a brief, impossible moment, I thought I might actually make it out. Then, something slammed into me like a wall of ice, cold and unrelenting. I was knocked off my feet, crashing to the floor. The air was knocked out of me, and I gasped for breath, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The figure was there again, towering over me, its cold eyes locked on mine, its grip tightening. But this time, I didn't feel fear. Not anymore. I had nothing left to lose. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a shard of broken glass, jagged and sharp, and shoved it into the creature's side. It screamed, but the sound wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural growl filled with rage, and it reverberated through the very walls. The figure recoiled, but it didn't let go. "You can't escape," it whispered, but its voice wavered. "You belong here now, like all the rest of us." I pushed harder, my hands shaking, the shard sinking deeper into the figure's flesh. It howled, the room shaking with the force of its anger. But as I pushed it away, something strange happened. The walls began to tremble, the light from the exit flickering violently, like it was fighting against the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The cold, the darkness, they all disappeared. The room, once so oppressive, became still. The whispers stopped. The air, though still heavy, no longer pressed in on me. I gasped for breath, trembling, as I finally pulled myself up. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door was open. The exit sign gleamed in the dim light, a beacon in the night. I ran. My legs felt weak, my body heavy with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The weight of what had happened, what I had seen, was too much to bear. And as I passed through the door, into the cold night air, I thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, I was free. But when I looked over my shoulder, the warehouse stood silent. Still. Empty. The darkness within had been left behind, but I knew, deep down, I was never truly free. The whispers followed me into the night. And in the shadows, I could still feel the cold grip of the figure, watching, waiting. I had escaped the warehouse, but I hadn't escaped it. Not really. It started with a question I couldn't answer. Why did I get on that bus? It was a usual night. Cold, quiet, just like any other. I was tired, barely holding my eyes open as I slumped into the worn seat. The hum of the engine was almost soothing, and the soft flicker of the dim lights made the interior feel almost safe. A quick ride home, nothing unusual. Or so I thought. But then the bus stopped. No stoplight, no announced station, just a sudden halt in the middle of the road. I glanced around, confused. The driver didn't say a word. No one on the bus seemed to notice. The other passengers, a scattered mix of people, were still, like shadows in the gloom. Their faces hidden by the night, their bodies motionless. I looked out the window. It was dark, the streetlights barely cutting through the night fog. I saw nothing but emptiness ahead, a road that seemed to stretch forever. Why had we stopped? I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I was too tired to worry about it. Maybe we were just waiting for another bus to pass, or maybe the driver had to take a moment. But no, that wouldn't explain the stillness, the silence. I shifted again, but something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something wrong with the air. something not right. A faint smell lingered, like burning rubber, but sharp, acrid, almost metallic. I glanced around again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, not from the streetlights or the interior light. It moved, slowly. A figure just outside the window. A tall, dark shape stretching unnaturally as if it was part of the fog itself. But no one could be there. Not at this hour. And certainly not that large. I blinked and it was gone. I stared at the spot for a moment longer, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the feeling didn't fade. The air felt thicker now, heavier. My pulse quickened. I looked back at the other passengers. They hadn't moved, hadn't noticed anything. Or so it seemed. Maybe I'm just imagining things, I muttered to myself. But the words didn't make me feel better. In fact, they only made the silence more deafening. The bus was still. The road outside was still. But something inside me was starting to shift, to crawl in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong, and I couldn't explain it. The figure. The shadow. I couldn't shake the thought. The bus started moving again. The engine rumbled, and we were off, cruising down the road as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't relax. My thoughts raced. My eyes darted around, scanning the interior. The bus felt different now. The air heavier. The lights flickered. And then another stop. The doors opened with a soft hiss. No one got on. No one got off. I stayed seated, unsure of what I should do. The doors were wide open now, and the cool night air swept in, rustling papers on the floor. The scent from before was stronger now. That metallic tang. A shadow stretched across the floor, moving swiftly. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced towards the window, expecting to see it again. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't alone on this bus. Something was watching me. And that was just the beginning. I wasn't sure how much time had passed since the bus had stopped. Minutes? Hours? The clock on the wall had stopped ticking, the second hand frozen in place, as though time itself had come to a halt. The door was still open. I hadn't noticed before, but the light outside had shifted. The world outside the bus was now an abyss, a shadowy blur, as if the night itself had thickened and swallowed everything. The faint glow of the street lamps barely made it through the dense fog, now suffocating the road. And the silence, it was suffocating. Not the quiet you find late at night, where the hum of distant cars or the soft rustling of leaves might comfort you. No, this silence was thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I looked around at the other passengers. None of them moved. No one spoke. I felt their eyes on me, though none of them were looking in my direction. The shadows under their faces were too deep to make out their expressions clearly. Their hands were clenched around their bags or resting stiffly on their laps. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my mouth felt dry. My thoughts were scattered, fractured. I kept glancing at the open doors, wondering why no one had stepped out. Wondering why no one was reacting. I slowly leaned forward in my seat, my body feeling heavier as I fought the growing unease in my chest. What was wrong with this place? Why didn't it feel like the city I knew? It was as if the world had changed while I wasn't looking, as if I was trapped in a place that existed outside of time. A sudden noise broke through the stillness. a scraping sound, slow and deliberate. I turned sharply to my left, searching for the source. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd hear from the bus, nothing metal grinding against metal, nothing mechanical. This was something else. Something alive. I froze. The scraping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again, but my heart was pounding in my ears. Was it my imagination? Was I going crazy from the stillness? Then, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the doors, where the fog seemed thickest. It was tall, too tall. The silhouette was vaguely human, but there was something wrong with the proportions. Its legs were too long, the arms unnaturally long, like they had been stretched beyond reason. The shape lurked in the fog, its features too blurred to make out. But I could feel its presence. It was watching me, studying me, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. My throat tightened. I tried to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But my body refused to move. My eyes locked onto the figure, the terror slowly creeping into my veins. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the air felt thicker, harder to pull into my lungs. The metallic scent was overwhelming now. My stomach churned. Then, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It glided. Its form shifted unnaturally, as if the very air bent around it, as though it was never fully part of this world. With each movement, the shadows seemed to stretch and distort, like it was both there and not there at all. It reached out. I couldn't see its hand, but I felt it. The air shifted, as if something was pushing against me, like I was being drawn towards it. The temperature in the bus dropped. I could see my breath now, fogging up in front of me. The other passengers remained motionless. No one reacted. It was only me. Suddenly, the figure stopped. Its arm, or whatever that was just inches away from the door. I felt my heart skip a beat. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to jump out of my seat and run, but my body refused to obey. Then, the bus jolted. The engine roared to life, louder than before. The lights flickered, almost going out, before settling on a dim glow. The doors slammed shut, cutting off the figure from view. The bus lurched forward, the tires screeching against the road. I breathed again, but it wasn't relief. Not yet. The bus moved faster, almost too fast, as though it were running from something. The city outside blurred, the buildings flashing by in a whirlwind of motion. The usual quiet city streets had been replaced by dark, winding roads that seemed to go nowhere. We were leaving everything behind, heading deeper into the unknown. I looked at the other passengers again, and this time I saw something new. Their eyes were open, not looking at me, but staring ahead, blank, hollow. They weren't breathing. They weren't alive. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was alone. I could feel it now, the weight of the eyes upon me. I wasn't imagining it. The passengers weren't just staring ahead, they were staring through me. Their faces were ashen, drained of any life or warmth. Eyes wide open, but hollow, vacant. There was no breath, no movement, no sign of humanity in them at all. I wanted to scream, to shout, to ask them what was going on, but the words caught in my throat. My body was frozen, still, unwilling to break the suffocating silence. I turned back to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the world had become something else entirely. The streets that had once been familiar, filled with the usual shadows and neon signs, were now unrecognizable. The buildings had distorted, their windows black and gaping. Some were leaning at odd angles, defying logic. The pavement stretched forward in jagged lines, as though the road had been torn apart and pieced back together carelessly. The bus sped through this nightmarish landscape, moving faster than any vehicle should. I could hear the tires screeching, the engine growling in an unnatural way, as if it were struggling to keep us on course. The darkness outside seemed to close in, wrapping around the bus like a tight, suffocating coil. A strange noise cut through the air, soft at first, like the whisper of wind through the vents. But it wasn't wind. It was a voice. A faint whisper, like a distant murmur in the back of my mind. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew one thing: it was coming from the passengers. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. Every single one of them, every last soul on the bus, had their lips parted slightly. Their mouths were moving, not in the way a person speaks. Their lips were twitching, pulling open, but they weren't forming any words. It was as if something else, something unseen, was using them as a vessel to speak. A chill ran down my spine. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, almost suffocating. But still, no words. Just noise. A cacophony of unintelligible sounds that seemed to stretch the fabric of reality itself. I clutched the edge of my seat, trying to block it out. The air felt thick, charged, as though the very atmosphere was alive, buzzing with an invisible presence. I glanced at the driver, hoping to find some sense of normalcy. But the moment my eyes met his, I froze. His face, his empty face, was twisted, the skin pulled too tightly over his skull. His eyes were wide and dark, pupils dilated to an unnatural size, as if he were lost in a trance. There was nothing there. No awareness. No recognition. Just an empty shell, a vessel devoid of life. I could feel the bus lurch again, as though we were speeding up even more, tearing through the night at an impossible pace. The whispers grew louder still. The air became suffocating, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. My breathing became erratic, shallow. I had to escape. I looked at the doors. They were locked. There was no escape, no way out. The windows, too, were sealed tight, as though the world outside had been shut off completely. There was no way to break through. No way to free myself from this nightmare. The figure, the one I had seen outside, standing in the fog. Was it still there? I didn't dare look. I couldn't let myself think about it. I felt like I was suffocating, my chest tight as the whispers echoed louder, twisting and warping until they seemed to be coming from every direction. The passengers weren't just silent observers anymore. They were watching me, their vacant eyes following my every movement. Then, I felt it again, the pressure. That sensation that something was wrong, that something was watching me, just out of sight. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising on my arms. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I stood up, slowly, carefully, as though any movement might trigger something terrible. I walked down the aisle, my shoes tapping against the warm floor, each step making the noise seem louder than the last. The whispers grew quiet, almost as though they were waiting for something. For me. I reached the front of the bus, my eyes locked on the driver. His face, it wasn't just empty anymore. It was changing. The skin around his mouth stretched wider, too wide. His lips cracked, and a strange, wet sound echoed from his throat. A low, guttural growl. And then, just as I stepped forward, he turned his head slowly. His eyes locked onto mine, but they weren't his anymore. They were dark, void-like, empty pits that seemed to draw me in. I felt my legs falter, the ground beneath me seeming to give way. I staggered back, gasping for air, but no air came. My throat tightened. The bus suddenly jerked again, and everything went dark. When the darkness took over, it wasn't like turning off a light. It was gradual, like a slow descent into a bottomless pit. At first, it was just a flicker, the edges of the dim lights around the bus dimming to an almost imperceptible glow. Then, the darkness consumed everything. The sound of the engine, the whispers, the distant noise of the tires against the road, all of it ceased to exist. I was weightless. I couldn't feel the seat beneath me anymore. The air was cold, almost unbearably so, and it wrapped around me like a thick fog, suffocating me, making it harder to breathe. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and panicked. But then, something else. A sharp noise. A crack, like the snap of something breaking. And with that, a feeling of vertigo, as though the very ground beneath me had given way. I was falling. I gasped, reaching for something to hold on to, but my hands met only empty air. It was as if I was suspended in nothingness, hanging between worlds. My body tumbled through the void, spinning uncontrollably. The cold air rushed past my skin, the sensation of falling never stopping, the weightlessness pulling me deeper into the abyss. I wanted to scream. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My mouth was dry, my throat constricting in panic. There was nothing I could do to stop it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation of falling ended. I crashed into something solid. I wasn't in the bus anymore. I wasn't anywhere familiar. My body slammed into the ground, and I gasped for air, my lungs burning as though I hadn't breathed in hours. My hands pressed into the cold, rough surface beneath me, and I forced myself to sit up, blinking rapidly to clear the haze from my mind. Where was I? I looked around, heart hammering in my chest. The ground was uneven, cracked in places, as if it had been abandoned long ago. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic. The sky overhead was pitch black, no stars, no moon, just an endless expanse of darkness, pressing in from all sides. I stood shakily, my legs weak beneath me, and turned in a slow circle. It was a barren landscape, not unlike an old, decaying factory yard, but far more surreal. The buildings were twisted, their windows broken, the structure of the walls bending in unnatural ways. Nothing about this place made sense. It felt wrong, as if reality itself had been warped here. And then, the sound. A low, rumbling noise, distant at first, like thunder. But it wasn't thunder. No, this was something else, something far more menacing. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly, a warning that I couldn't ignore. The rumbling grew louder, closer. I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just shadows and empty space. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. A flicker, like the faintest glow of a dying flame. It was small, far off, but it was moving. I couldn't make out what it was, but the shape, no, it wasn't a shape. It was a shadow that moved with purpose, like something searching, hunting. I didn't want to look at it. I wanted to run, to get as far away from whatever that was. but my body refused to cooperate. My feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground. The light, the shadow, it was drawing closer, getting bigger. The rumble in the air grew louder, vibrating my chest, until it felt like my heart was echoing with the same terrible beat. The whispers returned. They weren't quiet anymore. They were right next to me, swirling around my head, pressing into my skull like 100 voices trying to get in. They spoke in strange, twisted phrases, distorted and garbled, but each word was clear in its intent. Run. Hide. It's coming. I couldn't understand, but the urgency was there. I had to get away from that thing. Whatever it was. I forced myself to move, stumbling as I took a step forward, then another. My legs felt weak, but I pushed forward, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. The glow in the distance was now much brighter, and I could see the figure more clearly. It was a person, or what should have been a person. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its body seemed to stretch and distort with every movement. Its arms swung unnaturally long, and its legs dragged behind it, twitching and jerking. But it wasn't walking, no, it was gliding, floating inches above the ground. My stomach twisted in fear, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. It sees you. Run. The ground beneath my feet trembled more violently now, and I had to brace myself against it, gripping onto whatever I could. I looked back, and the figure was much closer now, its distorted face a blur, but the eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. Hollow. Empty. Watching me. I ran. My legs moved faster than they had ever moved before, driven by pure, unrelenting fear. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, jagged, as if it were fighting against me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. That thing, it was closer now, its distorted figure looming in my peripheral vision, its eyes locked onto mine, no longer distant, but closer than ever. I glanced over my shoulder for just a second, and it was there. The thing, floating just behind me, its body twitching and jerking in unnatural movements, dragging its long limbs with a chilling slowness. Its face was a blur, but I could still see the emptiness in its eyes. Those black, hollow eyes were so cold. I could feel the emptiness consuming me just by looking into them. The whispers were a maddening cacophony now, filling every corner of my mind. It's coming. It's coming for you. Run faster. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing like thunder, drowning out everything else. The ground trembled beneath me, and I stumbled, my foot catching on something sharp, some broken shard of metal or stone. I bit my lip to stop from screaming as the pain shot up my leg. But there was no time to rest. I pushed myself back up, ignoring the ache in my knee, forcing my legs to keep moving. I had to get away. I had to. A scream ripped from my throat as the thing's hand, no, its claw, shot out, snagging the back of my jacket. I could feel the cold, icy grip pulling me backward, tearing at my flesh. I swung my arm wildly, trying to break free, but it was too strong, too relentless. I spun around, my heart racing. The creature's face was now clearer, so much clearer. It was an amalgamation of shadows, its features ever shifting, distorting with every blink. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was slick and pale, stretched too tightly over bone. Its mouth was open wide, but there was no sound. Its lips didn't move, but somehow I could hear it speaking in my head in whispers that froze my blood. You can't escape. There is no way out. In a blind panic, I reached for the nearest thing I could grab, an old, rusted pipe sticking out of the ground. My hand wrapped around it, and for a moment, I felt the cold steel bite into my palm. I wrenched myself free from the creature's grasp, pulling with all my might. The creature's grip loosened just enough for me to slip away, and I took off again. My breath was ragged, my vision blurry, but I kept running. Each step was like a battle against my own body. The whispers grew louder. I could feel them clawing at the back of my mind, pulling at my sanity. The world around me had become a nightmare. The landscape was unrecognizable, shifting with every passing second. The buildings that had been twisted before were now collapsing in on themselves, their structures crumbling into dust. The ground beneath me cracked open in jagged lines, revealing nothing but pitch-black voids beneath. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A bus. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The bus was identical to the one I had been on, the bus. I could barely believe my eyes. Was it a hallucination? A trick of my mind? Or was this where it had all started? It was impossible. But the urge to get back onto the bus, to find some semblance of reality, overwhelmed me. My feet carried me toward it, faster than before. Maybe if I got inside, if I just sat down, the nightmare would end. The bus doors creaked open as if expecting me. I didn't hesitate. I bolted up the steps and rushed inside. The moment I stepped over the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind me with a violent crash, and the world outside disappeared. Inside, the bus was empty. No passengers. No driver. No noise. Just silence. But that silence was even more terrifying. It was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, listening to the deafening quiet. And then, as if on cue, the bus jerked into motion. The bus began to move. The road outside was nothing but a blur. There was no turning, no way to predict where it was going. My body pressed into the seat as the vehicle accelerated faster, faster than I thought possible. I looked out the window, desperate for something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. The streets outside were completely different now, the city unrecognizable. There were no more familiar buildings or streetlights. Instead, there was nothing but blackness, the roads winding into infinity, twisting and curling like a snake eating its own tail. I wasn't on the bus anymore. The bus was in me. The nightmare had consumed everything. There was no escape. No way back. The creature, the thing from before, wasn't gone. I could feel its presence, creeping closer. I felt its cold eyes on the back of my neck. The whispers were back. Louder this time, closer. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. I couldn't even tell if I was still alive. "You're never leaving." The words echoed through my mind, and I realized, with a chilling certainty, that they were true. The bus wasn't a way out. The bus was the trap. And I had just boarded my final stop. It all began with a question I couldn't shake off. How could something from the past come back to haunt you? I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the unopened letter in front of me. It had no return address, just my name written in a neat, old-fashioned script. The envelope was yellowed with age, as if it had been preserved through time. There was something almost nostalgic about it, yet something ominous about the way it sat there, beckoning me to open it. But I hesitated. My heart raced as I looked at the letter, feeling the weight of it pressing into my chest. I have received strange things before, junk mail, advertisements, even a few random bills, but this felt different. The fact that it had arrived so suddenly, with no explanation, made it feel like something I couldn't ignore. I reached out and slowly slid my finger under the flap, tearing it open. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper, yellowed and worn, with writing in the same elegant handwriting. It read, "Do not trust the people around you. They are hiding something. Everything you believe to be true is a lie." I blinked. The words swam before my eyes. Who wrote this? The paper itself felt like it had been in a drawer for decades, its edges curled with age. It seemed impossible that this letter was written just recently, yet it looked so ancient. I put the letter down, my hands trembling. I wasn't sure why, but my first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank. But deep down, something about it gnawed at me. The words felt too familiar, too intimate, like the writer knew something I didn't. A sense of unease washed over me. I couldn't place why, but I felt as though someone was watching me, waiting for my next move. I stood up and walked around my small apartment. It had the usual quiet atmosphere, familiar, comforting. Yet the silence now seemed louder than ever, almost suffocating. I could feel my pulse quicken. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed. Something was different. But what? I glanced at the window. There was nothing unusual about the view. The street outside was as it always had been, with cars parked on the side, people walking down the sidewalk. But the noise of the world outside didn't seem to reach me the way it used to. It felt distant, like I was in a bubble, cut off from everything around me. I returned to the kitchen table, my eyes returning to the letter. I picked it up again, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a mistake. But then my gaze fell on the bottom of the page, where there was something I hadn't noticed before. A small postscript, written hastily in the same ink. "The past will always catch up to you." I froze. The words were so simple, yet they carried an undeniable weight. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "The past will always catch up to you." It was as if someone had taken my deepest fears and put them on paper. And in that moment, I realized that this letter wasn't just a random message. It was a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was connected to something bigger, something far darker than I could understand. It wasn't just a strange letter from a stranger. It was a message from someone who knew my past, my family, and perhaps something even darker that I hadn't yet discovered. The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel as though the past, something I had long buried, was coming back to claim me. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I could feel it in my bones. Just as I was about to turn away, the sound of a creak in the hallway startled me. I froze, listening. My mind raced. There was no one else here, no one except for me. And yet, the creak of the floorboards echoed through the silent apartment. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. I looked around, trying to make sense of the sound. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. But the apartment was empty, just as it had been before. Still, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. I slowly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, almost as if I were trying to put it back in time, to return it to wherever it had come from. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I was no longer alone. Something had shifted, and I had a sinking feeling that this letter was only the beginning of something much larger. The night stretched on in its familiar silence, but it no longer felt like the same world I had woken up to. As I sat back down in the chair, the unease from earlier seemed to settle around me like a fog. My apartment, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The walls, the windows, the door, all of them seemed to be watching me, closing in with every passing second. My hands trembled as I tried to focus on anything other than the unsettling letter. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words, "The past will always catch up to you." I rubbed my face, trying to shake the feeling. I needed to calm down, to think this through. It could just be a strange coincidence. It wasn't like I had a particularly mysterious past, or so I thought. I had grown up in this city, a typical childhood, some memories that I wasn't too proud of, but nothing that could haunt me. No ghosts from the past, right? But that letter had said something. It had said more than just ominous words. It had said everything I believed was a lie. And now was the moment I realized I couldn't just sit here anymore. I needed answers. I had to figure out what was happening. I stood up, pacing around the small apartment. The creak in the hallway echoed again, just as it had earlier, but this time I didn't stop to listen. I couldn't afford to think about it. Instead, I grabbed my phone from the table and checked the time. It was almost midnight. I hadn't heard the mailman earlier in the day. Perhaps it was some kind of mix-up. Perhaps the letter was meant for someone else. But as I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the door, I froze. The sound of a heavy thud against the door, someone knocking. It wasn't the gentle tap of a neighbor, nor the hurried knock of a delivery person. No, this knock was deep, deliberate, almost as if the person on the other side knew exactly what was going on. I hesitated, frozen to the spot. My heart began to pound again, and the fear that had been creeping up my spine earlier gripped me tightly. There was no way anyone was supposed to be here, not at this time, not after the letter. I slowly approached the door, pressing my ear to the wood. The silence that followed the knock felt suffocating, as though the world had stopped breathing. "Who's there?" I whispered it to myself, unsure if I even wanted to hear the answer. The knock came again, louder this time. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it. But before I could open it, a second letter slid under the door. I jumped back, almost stumbling. The envelope, identical to the first one, rested just inside, waiting for me. The same yellow paper, the same handwriting, the same chilling feeling. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to shrink as I bent down to pick up the letter, my mind racing. Why now? Why here? I tore the envelope open with a force I didn't know I had, almost ripping the paper in my haste. Inside, I found a single sheet, the words scrawled across it in that same unsettling script. The past is not a memory. It's a shadow, a part of you. You can't escape what is already inside you. The ink was still wet, as though it had been written only moments ago. My heart hammered in my chest. What did this mean? What part of me is it talking about? I stood there, staring at the paper, trying to piece together what I was missing. But nothing made sense. The letter was more cryptic than the first, more personal, more sinister. My mind raced, thinking back to everything that had happened in my life. The memories, the moments I had thought were gone. Had I forgotten something? Had I buried something so deep that it had come back now to torment me? I dropped the letter, the paper slipping from my hands. My fingers were numb, my chest tight. But it was then that I noticed something new. A faint shadow, stretching across the floor. I turned to look, but no one was there. But the shadow didn't disappear. It lingered, stretching, twisting. It seemed to move against the grain of the light in the room as if it had a life of its own. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. It's just a trick of the light. My mind was frantically telling me to stay calm, to reason with myself, but my body was already betraying me. My hands shook as I grabbed the letter again, reading the words over and over. The past is non-memory. It's a shadow. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. Not when I felt like the past was already inside me. That shadow was growing, stretching into the corners of the room. And I knew, deep in my gut, that it was just the beginning. I could hear the distant hum of the city outside, muffled by the thick walls of my apartment, but inside, it felt as though everything had been swallowed by silence. The shadow, which had once seemed like a mere trick of the light, was now undeniable. It wasn't just stretching on the floor anymore, it was moving, shifting against the corners, creeping up the walls like it was alive. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around the room, searching for some logical explanation. The walls seemed to press in on me, and the faint scent of something musty filled the air, like old books or forgotten places. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the shadow only seemed more pronounced, darker, more solid. It's just a shadow, I told myself, my voice barely a whisper as I spoke aloud, trying to break the tension. But even as I said the words, I knew they were meaningless. I needed to leave, to get out of this room, but my feet wouldn't move. The fear had sunk deep into my bones, locking me in place. The shadow didn't seem to notice the walls. It crawled up the door frame, snaking its way toward the ceiling, where it began to swirl, as though it were seeking something that I couldn't understand. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I backed away slowly, one step at a time, trying not to disturb the growing presence that seemed to watch my every movement. Then I remembered the letter. The one I had just opened. The words, "The past is non-memory. It's a shadow, a part of you. You can't escape what is already inside you," kept repeating in my mind like a chant, growing louder with every passing moment. I dropped the letter once again, this time with no thought to its fate. My eyes were focused solely on the shadow that had crept further into the room. "It's just a shadow," I repeated like a mantra, hoping that if I said it enough, the reality of what was happening might shift. But it didn't. The shadow wasn't fading. It was growing. Suddenly, a knock at the door. 3 quick raps, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to strike. I jumped, startled out of my thoughts, my heart racing as I turned toward the door. The shadow didn't seem to care about the interruption. It lingered, like something persistent, refusing to let me go. For a long moment, I stood there, unable to move. Who could it be at this hour? I hadn't expected anyone. There were no visitors, no calls, no reason for anyone to be here. The knocking came again, but louder this time. Almost insistent. With a shaking hand, I reached for the doorknob, my mind still reeling with the events of the past few minutes. The shadows felt like they were crawling over me, trying to drag me into some unseen abyss. But I had no choice. I had to answer. I had to confront whatever was out there. I opened the door, slowly, cautiously, trying to avoid the view of whatever darkness was creeping inside. But as the door creaked open, I found nothing. The hallway was empty, as it should be. The building was quiet, no one in sight. But there was something else, a small package, placed neatly on the welcome mat. The brown paper was aged, torn slightly at the edges, as if it had been here for much longer than just a few moments. I bent down to pick it up, my pulse quickening as I touched the weathered surface. There was no return address, no name, no markings except for a single phrase written in fading ink. The shadow never leaves. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. My hands trembled as I tore open the paper. Inside, there was nothing but a small, worn-out photograph. The image was blurry, but I could make out a face, a woman's face, pale, her features obscured by the passage of time. But what caught my attention wasn't the image itself. It was the date scrawled across the bottom of the photo, June 12, 1923. I felt my stomach drop. That date was significant, but I couldn't place why. The name on the back, written in faint pencil, was even worse: Evelyn, your grandmother. My mind reeled. Grandmother? My grandmother had never spoken of a woman named Evelyn. She'd never mentioned any family secrets, not once. Could it be real? Was this some kind of sick joke? A game that someone was playing at my expense? The photograph felt heavier than it should have been, as though it was burdened with something more than just paper and ink. I could almost feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I wanted to throw it away, to forget about it, but I couldn't. The silence in the apartment deepened, suffocating me. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the shadow. It was larger now, moving like smoke curling in the air, drifting toward me with the photo still in my hands. I couldn't think. My mind felt foggy, as though something was pulling me down. I dropped the photo, watching it flutter to the floor, but the shadow didn't stop. It surrounded me, closing in. A voice, soft and distant, whispered in my ear. You can't escape what's already inside you. My knees gave way, and I collapsed, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the room spun around me. Everything, the letter, the shadow, the photo, was all coming together, forming something I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whisper stopped. The shadow disappeared. The silence was deafening. I was alone again, but I wasn't sure for how long. The room was quiet again. The shadow had receded, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I could still feel it, like a cold breath against my skin, a reminder of whatever it was that had come before me. My mind raced. The words from the letter, the photograph of Evelyn, my grandmother's secretive past, everything seemed to be crashing together, pulling me into something I couldn't escape. I picked up the photograph from the floor, my hands unsteady. The woman in the picture, Evelyn, stared up at me with those hollow, dark eyes. There was something unsettling about her expression, like she knew something I didn't. Something I needed to understand. My grandmother, what did she know about this? I turned the photograph over again, hoping to find some clue, some explanation hidden in the fading pencil marks. But there was nothing more, just that single, chilling name. Evelyn. My heart thudded in my chest. I knew that I couldn't just ignore this. The past was reaching out to me, pulling me into its depths. I had to know the truth. But what if I wasn't meant to? What if this was a warning? I couldn't stop myself. I had to know more. I grabbed my phone and dialed my grandmother's number, feeling an odd sense of urgency bubbling up inside me. She was getting old, frail. She had always been a woman of few words, but something about her presence had always brought a strange comfort. Now, the thought of her seemed like an anchor in a sea of confusion. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice weak but familiar. Hello? Grandma, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. It's me. Can we talk? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her processing the question, weighing her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice distant, cautious. What's on your mind, child? I hesitated. I found something. A photograph from, I stopped myself. From a long time ago. Of a woman named Evelyn. It's dated June 12, 1923. Do you know her? For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a low, almost tremulous voice, she responded, Where did you find that? You shouldn't be looking into things like that. My chest tightened. There was something in her tone, something hidden beneath the words. I pressed further. Grandma, please. You have to tell me. Who is she? Another long pause, the kind that felt like years stretching out. Then, finally, my grandmother spoke again, each word heavier than the last. Evelyn was my sister. She died when I was young. It was a long time ago. You shouldn't worry about her or what happened to her. Some things are better left forgotten. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to catch up with the sudden revelation. Her sister? This woman in the photograph was my great-aunt? But why had my grandmother never mentioned her? And why was the past still so present, so insistent on being uncovered? Before I could ask another question, my grandmother's voice broke through again. Promise me you'll stop, child. It's not something you can fix or understand. You'll only bring trouble. The line went dead before I could respond. My heart raced, and I was left in stunned silence, the words of my grandmother ringing in my ears. Stop. She wanted me to stop. But why? What was it that she knew that I didn't? The photo of Evelyn stared up at me from the floor, taunting me. Why wasn't this story over? I needed answers. And I knew that there was no turning back now. The shadow from before began to creep back into my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts. The past is not a memory. It's a shadow, a part of you. You can't escape what is already inside you. The words from the letter echoed louder than before, and I felt the cold, suffocating weight of them pressing against me. But something else, something more insidious, was beginning to seep through the cracks. I needed to go back. Back to the place where my grandmother grew up. Back to the house where Evelyn had died. There had to be something there. Something that connected me to this, something that could explain why the past was refusing to stay buried. I grabbed my coat, my fingers trembling as I zipped it up. I knew that I couldn't wait any longer. If I didn't go now, I might never get the answers I needed. As I stepped out the door and into the night, the chill in the air cut through me, sharper than it had been before. The world felt different now, heavier, like the weight of history itself was bearing down on me. And in the distance, I could have sworn I saw a figure, faint, just at the edge of my vision, standing in the shadows. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the dark, empty street ahead. The questions had started. Now, they would not stop until they were answered. I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the shadows. It was as though someone, something, was watching me. The streetlights flickered above, casting brief bursts of light that only made the darkness around me feel more oppressive. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind, you shouldn't be looking into things like that. But I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth. The past was calling to me, and it wasn't something I could just ignore. The house where my grandmother had grown up was on the outskirts of town, an old, crumbling Victorian structure that had been in our family for generations. It had stood the test of time, but there was an unsettling aura around it now. Even as a child, I'd sensed something wrong about it, the way the house seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, how the wind would whistle through the broken shutters, carrying with it strange sounds that never quite seemed natural. As I drove down the winding, overgrown road leading to the house, a cold wind swept through the trees, bending their branches in eerie shapes. The headlights of my car barely cut through the thick darkness that surrounded the property. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I pushed forward. When I arrived, the house loomed in front of me, just as I remembered. The large wooden door, painted a deep shade of green, was chipped and peeling. The once vibrant garden had long been overtaken by wild weeds, and the windows were dark and hollow, like the eyes of a long-dead thing. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The air smelled musty, damp with age. But underneath that, I could detect something faint, almost metallic. The same strange scent I had noticed earlier. I approached the door and hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering above the old brass handle. A part of me wanted to turn around, go home, and forget this whole thing. But I couldn't. I wasn't just searching for answers anymore, I was being pulled towards something. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound that seemed too loud in the silence of the night. The entryway was as I remembered, dusty and decayed, but there was a thick sense of dread hanging in the air now. I could feel it crawling along my skin. Something was wrong here, and I wasn't sure if it was the house itself or the fact that I was stepping into a past that wasn't mine. I walked deeper into the house, my footsteps muffled by the creaky floorboards. As I passed the old portraits of my ancestors, their eyes seemed to follow me. The air was thick with the weight of history, of family secrets. My grandmother had always been so protective of her past, so secretive. But now, as I walked through these halls, it was like I could feel her presence, her fear, lingering here. I reached the stairs that led up to the second floor. The moment my foot touched the first step, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the fluttering of paper. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the hallway at the end of the stairs. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else entirely. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward the hallway, my breath shallow. The sound grew louder with each step I took until it was unmistakable. It was the sound of pages turning, slowly, deliberately. I turned the corner and found myself standing before a small study, a room I had never been in before. The door was ajar, just wide enough for me to peer inside. There, on the desk, lay an open book. The pages were turning on their own, as if caught in an invisible breeze. My pulse quickened. I stepped into the room, my eyes never leaving the book. The moment I crossed the threshold, the pages stopped turning, and the room went deathly silent. I approached the desk, my hand trembling as I reached out toward the book. The title was faded, but I could just make out the words, The Legacy of the Forgotten. I opened the cover, and the smell of old paper hit me like a wave. My fingers brushed across the first page, and I froze. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. It was my grandmother's. But it wasn't just her handwriting. The words were different, erratic, frantic. The sentences jumped off the page as if the writer was racing to finish, desperate to get something down before time ran out. Evelyn was the key. She knew too much. I never should have let her leave. The past is coming back. We cannot escape. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The writing grew more chaotic, the words blurred with smudges of ink. There was a name at the end of the last page, a name I didn't recognize. The Collector. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. My grandmother had written this? Why had she never told me? What had Evelyn known, and why was it so important to keep it hidden? And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, but there was no one there. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The temperature in the room had dropped. My skin was ice cold, and my fingers trembled uncontrollably. The figure from the shadows, the one I had seen earlier, it was here. I could feel it. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. This wasn't just about family secrets. There was something much darker at play here, something that went beyond the past. The Collector. Evelyn, my grandmother's warnings, they were all connected. And now, it seemed, I was the one being drawn into their grasp. As I turned to leave the room, I saw something in the corner of my movement. A shadow. But when I looked, it was gone. I needed to get out of there. Now. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.